Hello and welcome to Hutong History, a podcast about the history of Beijing. I'm Doug Rooney, your host, and I have lived in Beijing for longer than really any other city in my adult life. So, in this, the first episode of what I hope to be an ongoing series, I thought I would take us right to the start of Beijing's story, before there was even a city, or indeed a China. For today, we are going to talk about Peking Man, the very first Beijinger. Peking Man was, or were, since there were more than one of them, not human, or at any rate not Homo sapien. Peking Man was a member of the hominin subgrouping Homo erectus and lived in and around the area we now call Beijing from around 770,000 years ago to around 230,000 years ago. The species itself, that is Homo erectus, would endure from around 2 million years ago up to as recently as 100,000 years ago, which makes it, to date, the most successful human species to ever walk this earth. Why don't you join me as we pop into our little time machine and go and find out about the first hominin resident of Beijing? But before we go back into the darkness of prehistory, I want to stop our little time machine off at a much more recent date. That would be September 1993. As we get out of our little time machine at the Zhoukou Peking Man site, the first thing we are probably going to notice is a group of young people, students from nearby universities, dressed up as cavemen of the Flintstones variety. They are huddled around a very old man who is holding aloft a flaming torch. If you know anything about the world of Chinese anthropology, you will recognize this old man as the legendary Jia Lanpo, the anthropologist who, at this site in 1936, discovered three almost intact Homo erectus skulls, and, in a long and illustrious career, helped put Zhoukou on the map as one of the most productive Homo erectus archaeological sites in the world. In 1993, Jia is in his 80s, and he is participating in the opening ceremony of the 7th National Games of the People's Republic of China. The torch he holds will soon be passed over to a runner, who will take it down to Tiananmen Square, some 50 kilometres to the northeast of where we now stand, where it will take place in the grand opening of the Games, presided over by figures from the Chinese government and luminaries of the Communist Party of China. Now, perhaps after taking all this in, you might start asking yourself why a retired anthropologist with a specialist interest in the Paleolithic era is taking part in the opening ceremony of a sporting contest along with a bunch of students dressed as cavemen. Well, to really understand this, we must first understand the symbolism at play here. You see, Jia and his colleagues at the China Academy of Science believe that there is evidence at the Zhoukou site that Homo erectus could harness the power of fire. This would make Peking Man the world's earliest known user of fire, which is a very big deal indeed. To quote a tourist brochure from the time, we can say without any exaggeration that the fire in Zhoukou illuminated the world. Grand stuff indeed. This claim is not without controversy. Certainly, there is scientific consensus that, at least for part of its history and in some geographical range, Homo erectus cooked food. There is, however, vigorous debate about exactly how they went about doing this. Some, like Jia, theorise Homo erectus could start and control fires. Others hypothesize that Homo erectus could use naturally occurring springs to boil their food, a behaviour recorded in some monkeys, for example, or merely took the opportunities afforded to it by naturally occurring fires. The issue is that at such a great remove, it is almost impossible to determine if someone started a fire deliberately. To date, nothing like a hearth has been found. Now, the more conservative hypothesis is still a great leap in human cognition, but it is not the revolution that Jia and his supporters wish to present for their site. By including Zhou Kodian in the opening ceremony of the 1993 Games, and again in the run up to the 2008 Olympics, the Chinese government is picking a side in this fairly obscure scientific debate, and is claiming Zhoukou and hence the Greater Beijing area, as one of the most important cradles of civilization, a literal light in the darkness. On the other side of the debate are arrayed a group of predominantly liberal and Western educated academics who claim that the China Academy of Science and other such institutions or letting good nationalist myth-making lead the evidence. The fire question isn't even the only debate raging over Homo erectus. A sometimes heated discussion is taking place over what Homo erectus in China can tell us about the human evolution. As such, the debates over Peking Man mirror the cultural divide and the culture war within Chinese academia more broadly. But before we get onto the ongoing culture war surrounding Peking Man, let's first learn a bit about this first Beijinger. To really understand who Peking Man was, we need to zoom out and look at the whole family album. Homo erectus is one of the most successful and long-lasting species of our human family tree. Think of them as the ancient explorers of the prehistoric world. They first appeared in Africa around 2 million years ago, and, unlike their predecessors, who mostly stayed put, they had a serious case of wanderlust. They spread across Asia and Europe, adapting to all sorts of environments. And they were built for it too. Homo erectus was the first of our ancestors to have a body plan that looked a lot like ours. Taller, an adult could range between 150 and 160 centimetres, with longer legs built for walking and running, and modern-sized hands capable of precise gripping. Now, about that head. Their brains were significantly larger than earlier hominins, although still only about two-thirds the size of modern humans. And their faces were also distinct. They had a heavy brow ridge, a slow, sloping forehead, and a jaw that lacked a chin. You wouldn't want to see one in a dark alley, that's for sure, but you might be impressed by their toolkit. They are also associated with what archaeologists call the Antiloonian hand axe. Now, earlier humans and other ape species had used tools, but these are mostly naturally occurring pointy rocks, which the user had modified slightly to make more effective. The Anchulian hand axes, however, weren't just random rocks shaped for effect. They were teardropped shaped tools, carefully chipped on both sides to create a sharp edge. It was in many ways the Swiss army knife of the Stone Age, a tool so useful and well designed that the basic design didn't change for over 1 million years. The reason these axes are so awe-inspiring to us today is because they require imagination to make. Let me explain. To craft an Anchulian hand axe, you have to look at a rock and understand that after hours or even days of chipping away at it, it will become a tool. In other words, you must see the axe in your mind's eye before you will see it with your actual eye. This is a level of cognition far beyond most animals and many of our ancestors, and yet Homo erectus managed it. So, Homo erectus were clever, they were mobile, and they were adaptable. And the specimens found at Zhoukoudian, the Peking Man individuals that is, are some of the best examples we have of this species in Asia. They show us how this ancient explorer made a home far from its African origins. And how was it then that we came to learn about this first Beijinger? Well, that is thanks to an Austrian paleontologist called Otto Zansky. In 1921, Zdansky joined an expedition to China led by the Swede Johann Gunnar Andersson. Andersson had come across what we now call the Zhoukoudian site in an earlier expedition in 1918. The local peasants told him that an old quarry in a place called Chicken Bone Hill was known to give up dragon bones. Anderson was in China on the hunt for dinosaurs, and since dragon bones are often a folk stand-in for dinosaurs, felt it was a good place to do some digging before heading to their final and more promising destination in Shanxi province. As far as I know, Zdansky and his fellow diggers found no dinosaur fossils at Zhoukoudian, but he did come across a human tooth, known today as specimen PMU M3550. Later analysis would prove this tooth to belong to Homo erectus. Since this discovery came only 30 years after we, as human species, learned of the existence of Homo erectus, researchers returned to the site. On the 2nd of December 1929, Pei Wenzhong would discover the first Homo erectus skullcap, and in November 1936 would come Jia Lanpo's three skulls. Up until the outbreak of war on 7th of July 1937, the site would go on to employ about 100 locals full-time. Digging would stop for the duration of the war, and earlier specimens would be lost in the chaos as the researchers desperately tried to smuggle them out of wartime Beijing. Only the plasters of the original finds survive. But in 1958, paleontologists and anthropologists would return to the Zhoukoudian site. During the Mao period, Homo erectus became an important part of the government science education campaign aimed at sweeping away old superstitions of old China. And in 1962, Zhoukoudian became a national site of historical preservation. In 1997, the propaganda department would elevate the site to the National 100 Bases for Patriotic Education. But why patriotic education, you might ask? What could some bones from the Paleolithic have to do with modern Chinese patriotism? Before we discuss this, we need to talk about a pretty major scientific debate that hangs over Peking Man's place in human history. And it all comes down to a simple question. Did we all come from one place, or did we pop up in multiple places? Let's start with the theory you've probably heard of, the out of Africa theory. This is the current scientific consensus, more or less, and it's probably the theory you were taught in school. The idea is that modern humans, that is Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa somewhere around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Then, relatively recently in evolutionary terms, a small band of them left Africa and spread across the globe, replacing all the other hominins they encountered along the way. Think of it as one successful family moving out of the ancestral home and, well, everyone else eventually fading away. Under the model, Peking Man, that is Homo erectus, is a distinct cousin, an earlier branch of the human family tree that went extinct without contributing all that much, if anything, to our DNA. But there's an older, now largely discarded idea called polygenism that has a bearing on our story. Polygenism is the idea that different human populations evolved separately in different parts of the world, from different ancestral hominin groups. In other words, rather than all modern humans sharing a single recent origin in Africa, polygenism argues that we emerged in multiple places more or less independently, and then later would interbreed with each other. The theory gained a lot of traction in the late 19th and early 20th century, often tied to early anthropology and, unfortunately, used to justify racial hierarchies of European imperialism. The thinking went something like this. After early humans, like Homo erectus, spread out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago, populations in Africa, Asia, and Europe each evolved along their own tracks, eventually becoming the distinct races of modern humans. Under this view, these regional populations never fully merged. Instead, they maintained continuous lineages stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. In scientific terms, polygenism has been almost entirely abandoned. Modern genetics show that all living humans share a remarkably recent common ancestry, with the vast majority of their genetic variation coming from a single African origin within the last couple 100,000 years. The small amount of interbreeding with other humans, like the Neanderthals, for example, in Europe, only underscores that those other lineages were distinct branches, not parallel trunks leading to modern humans. That said, polygenism never fully disappeared as a cultural or political idea. Its appeal is pretty straightforward. It allows groups to claim an ancient, unbroken connection to a specific land, free from the implication that their ancestors arrived relatively recently as migrants. So while the science has moved decisively on, the deeper question, who gets to claim the deepest roots, has always had a little bit of sticking power. And this is where Peking Man comes in. As we have seen, the early discoveries at Zhoukoudian were made by Westerners or by young Chinese anthropologists working under Westerners. And many of the Europeans and North American scientists working in China in the 1920s and 30s were proponents of polygenism. The most important of these Western scientists was a man called Franz Weidenreich, who lived between 1873 and 1948. He was the director of the Zhoukoudian site in the 1930s and the founder of the Institute of Vertebra Paleontology and Paleoanthropology at the China Academy of Science. Jia Lampo, the guy honoured in the 1990s, Pei Wenzhong, the scientist who discovered the first Peking Man skull, and Yang Zhongyan, a former director, and very important one at that, of the Peking Man site, all studied under Weidenreich before going on to take on prominent positions at the China Academy of Science in the department that Weidenreich founded, where they would go on to direct public perceptions and academic study of Peking Man within China for decades. Now, Weidenreich's students, and the students of those students, are not actually defending polygenism into the modern day, but instead a much softer theory of multi-regional evolution called China origin Chinese. This says that after Homo erectus spread out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago, populations in different regions, Africa, Asia, Europe, etc., continued to evolve. But they stayed connected enough that they eventually all became modern humans together. In this version, Peking Man isn't just a cousin, he is a direct ancestor. The people living in China today, under this view, have a continuous evolutionary lineage stretching back to those Homo erectus skulls found at Zhoukou. Evidence of the China origin Chinese theory consists mostly of anatomical and morphological similarities between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens in China. Distinct Chinese tool sets found at Zhoukou, suggesting a different development path from those in Africa and Europe, and that the replacement of Homo erectus by Homo sapiens in China has never been adequately explained by the proponents of the out of Africa theory. The China origin Chinese defenders would suggest that their theory, that the two had merged, is a much better solution than anything proposed by the out of Africa proponents. Now, I'm not qualified to rule which of these theories has more validity. But I will say that recent genetic testing has suggested that the strictest interpretation of the out of Africa thesis might be wrong, and that some version of multi regional evolution, if not perhaps as strict or as wide ranging as the China origin Chinese, might be at play. A very recent study published in the Journal of Human Evolution in September 2025 also found evidence that Homo sapiens and Homo erectus were having children together as recently as 300,000 years ago, which, of course, has helped bolster the claims of the China origin Chinese folks. Now, it should be fairly obvious that the value of the China origin Chinese theory is to Chinese nationalists, communists, and the Chinese state. China origin Chinese, along with the fire theory, establish a unique place in the human story for China and the Chinese people, and by establishing a direct line from modern China to Peking Man, and projects Chinese civilization back into earliest epochs of the human story. At a time when China seeks to re-establish itself as one of the great centres of human civilization, this story is, of course, very appealing. However, it bears stating that the out of Africa theory is also, in its own way, political, or at least it can be. The out of Africa theory was used in the 20th century to beat down blatant white supremacy in the scientific community, and is an important part of the hegemonic liberal understanding of the human story. That is to say, that we are all brothers under the skin. The uniqueness or otherwise of any particular civilization is flattened in favour of a kind of liberal universalism. That is, of course, particularly convenient for a liberal US project which, as a settler colony, has no great claim to antiquity. I should point out that while supporters of one theory or the other will often clash online in vulgar arguments that get caught up in a culture war between Western orientated liberals on the one side and nationalists and communists on the other, the research behind these two theories in China are scientists first and foremost. Neither is falsifying data in pursuit of a political objective. Both have valid scientific reasons to support their theory and to doubt the other. But this is a reminder that all knowledge production is, at its core, ideological. It is no accident, for example, that the greatest supporters of the out of Africa are mostly Western educated liberal scientists, while those who support the China origin Chinese are academics with close links to the Communist Party of China. But let's leave the debates behind for a moment and climb back into our little time machine. Let's set the dial to around 500,000 years ago or so, and let's try and imagine a day in the life of one of these first Beijingers. The landscape around Zhoukou isn't much like Beijing today. There's no concrete, no smog, no ring roads. Instead, it's a mix of open grassland and scattered forests, with limestone hills rising up in jagged white cliffs. The climate is cooler than today. Think northern China in the long drawn out spring. And in one of those limestone hills, there's a cave mouth facing east, catching the morning sun. Inside the cave, a small group of Homo erectus is waking up. Let's call one of them, purely for storytelling purposes, Old Brow, because that heavy ridge along his eyes is hard to miss. He's short by modern standards, maybe 5'3" or 5'4", with a stocky build and powerful arms. His face is broad, his forehead slopes back, and he doesn't have much of a chin to speak of. But his hands are strong and capable, and his eyes are sharp. Old Brow's morning starts simply. He stretches, gives a grunt to the others, and heads to the cave entrance. Below, a narrow stream winds along the valley. He can hear the call of deers in the distance, and somewhere overhead, a giant hyena, a real monster of an animal, lumbers across the ridgeline. Old Brow watches it carefully. He's not the biggest thing out there. And indeed, many of the skeletons found at the Joko Dien site exhibit signs of being eaten by such an animal. Breakfast is whatever was left from yesterday. Maybe some nuts and berries gathered by a group's younger members. Maybe some bone marrow if they got lucky with a kill. But today the group needs meat. So Old Brow picks up one of the hand axes he napped a week before. Thousands of such devices have been found at the modern Peking Man site. It is a teardrop shaped in both ends and fits perfectly in his palm, and he joins a small band heading out to hunt. They don't hunt like modern humans would. They don't have bows or spears with sharpened stone points. Instead, their strategy is probably patience and opportunism. They track a herd of deer, for example, through the grassland, staying downwind, moving slowly. They're looking for something vulnerable, an old one lagging behind, a young one that strayed too far. When the moment comes, it's chaotic. They rush in, shouting, throwing rocks and swinging heavy wooden clubs. It's not elegant, but it works. By midday, they've got meat. They butcher it right there, using those hand axes we've seen before, to slice through the sinew and crack open bones from the marrow. Then they carry what they can back to the cave, because the cave is safety. The caves mean shelter from storms and shelter from the big cats and hyenas that would happily steal the meal or take one of them away to devour. Back at the cave, the afternoon light slants across limestone cliffs. Someone gets a fire going. Or maybe they don't. That is the part we still don't know for sure. Maybe they've learned to spark it themselves. Maybe they've carried a burning branch from one of the natural wildfires that occurs occasionally in these parts. Or maybe fire isn't theirs to command at all, just a rare gift when lightning strikes. But if they do have it, the smoke drifts up through a crack in the cave ceiling, and the flames keeps the darkness at bay. Around the fire they share the meat. They grunt and gesture at one another. A child plays with a scrap of hide. An old woman chips away at a piece of flint, shaping out a new blade. Here we get into speculation. We don't know if they have a language. We also don't know if they have art. Some have suggested that Homo erectus was capable of basic pictorial art, but the jury is still out. We also don't know if they had any rituals, any beliefs, any religious ceremonies. But what we do know is that they had each other. They have this place, this cave, this valley, this pocket of the world they've learned to survive in, and they have time. Generations will live here, die here, leave their bones in the cave floor. Thousands of generations, in fact, long before Beijing was a city, long before the emperors and dynasties, long before anyone wrote a single character. Old Brow and his kin were here, scratching out a life on the edge of an ancient landscape. They were the first Beijingers, and in a way, they have never left. Well, thank you very much for listening to this, the first episode in Hutong History, a podcast about the history of Beijing. If you like what you heard, please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. If you want to support my work, there are links in the description which will take you to all of my social media accounts and also places where you can maybe buy me a coffee if you are so inclined. Thank you for listening, and let me know what area of Beijing history you would like me to cover next time.